Welcome to Future Conversations, the podcast that explores research through the lens of tomorrow by Monash University, Malaysia.
Welcome to Future Conversations. I am Mira Siviso, the Professor of Practice, Digital Media and Communication, Monash University, Malaysia. And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the price of punishment, why Malaysia must rethink drug laws. For decades, Malaysia has waged a costly war on drugs, both financially and socially. What if decriminalisation of the possession and use of drugs isn't just about human rights, but also about economic sense? Joining me today to have this discussion, Palani Narayanan, Director of Drug Policy Program Malaysia. He's also a public health policy specialist. Welcome, Palani. And also Elisabeth Pisani, Director of Ternyata, which is a public health consultancy in the UK. Elisabeth is fantastic. She's got so much of experience in this field. She's an epidemiologist. She's best known for her work in HIV. She's also a visiting scholar at Monash University, Malaysia, and also advisor to the Drug Policy Program Malaysia. So I'm going to kickstart this conversation with the both of you today. What has been the financial and human cost of Malaysia's decades-long war on drugs? Palani, you want to kickstart? We spoke to Neil Woods in the past. He's given us really good insights on, how he battled that in the UK as a cop himself. But what's that been like in Malaysia?
Well, I think let's start with the human cost. I think, the war on drugs and drug policies have a major human cost. Number one, it costs lives. When we criminalize drugs become even more dangerous. They go underground. They are handled by organized criminals who don't really care about the health and well-being of people. So they create drugs that are even more dangerous. So we know drugs are bad, but we've given it to organized criminals to make them even worse. So as a result, we see the rates of overdoses increase across the world. We see people dying of health-related issues, HIV, hepatitis. We see death penalties, people put through death. So the cost to human lives is great. Then there is, of course, the economic cost. This is about recycling poverty. People who are poor and in poverty-stricken situations get involved in drugs, both using and transporting or selling. And those are the people who get caught, sent to prisons. They come out, their situation is the same. They go back to drugs. It's a cycle. It's a cycle of poverty that goes on.
So you want to say something about the financial cost?
Sure, I'll let Elisabeth go on the financial cost.
Thanks. I think just on the social cost, let's remember that every drug user is someone's daughter or son or mother or father or cousin or sister or teacher or cop. And so there's a massive social cost that is added to the human cost in terms of health. In terms of money, it's really difficult to track. So we're looking now, and this is the study that I'm involved in now with Monash, and it's not finished yet, so I'm not going to give you any massive spoilers in terms of money, but the different costs that we're looking at are not just the cost of policing and imprisonment, also the judicial system. So an extraordinarily high proportion of cases are related to drugs. People are cycling in and out of the system and in and out of the remand process. There's such a backlog of urine testing and drugs testing for proof that people are sometimes being kept in remand, that is without a charge, for 3 months, for 6 months. And in that time, they have to go back and forth to the judge for their remand to be extended. And all of that includes transport costs from the jail back to the courts and back again. So there are incremental costs that we're not really thinking about. The cost of urine testing alone is massive. So we're currently trying to calculate all of those costs. Part of the difficulty is that, of course, no one's saying that all drugs should be completely legal and sold in markets like bananas or papayas. So there's still going to be a part of the law enforcement costs which are legitimately going after the big fish in the drug system. But what we're talking about is decriminalizing the use, the personal possession. So when we're trying to calculate the costs, we have to try and parse out those two things. What's the cost of harmful criminalization of use and personal possession? We've got costs of urine testing. We've got costs of... So the financial costs are we know they're large. We're at the moment trying to calculate exactly what they are and how much of that can be apportioned to the policy of criminalizing use and individual possession. So criminalizing the substance use disorder, which is a health condition that probably shouldn't be putting people in jail. We're trying to separate out those costs, but we're looking at costs of the judiciary, costs of urine testing, costs of transport back and forth between the remand centres and the courts, back to prisons, cost of incarceration, obviously the cost of any treatment that's happening in incarceration, which is unfortunately rather a small part of the costs. So there are many different things that we're trying to calculate, but and I'm not going to give you any big spoilers because we haven't completed the research yet, but as an order of magnitude, we're talking about $1 billion a year just in prisons costs, and about the same again in the other total costs of judiciary policing, health costs, etc. So it's a large amount of money, 1 billion ringgit a year, plus.
Sorry about that. Palani, someone in the Ministry of Home Affairs, I know, has released some numbers, and it costs 1 billion ringgit annually on prison costs alone. And they sort of made a comparison to the fact that for that money, you can hire 5,000 specialist doctors to help reduce waiting times at hospitals. So that's 1 billion already. And then you're talking about the cost of seizures linked to drug and substance-related crimes were valued at 2.3 billion ringgit. So, I mean, where are we getting these numbers from? I mean, have we really gone down to... Are you saying perhaps, Elisabeth, this could be much more?
I think that that's probably the correct order of magnitude for the actual real costs to the state alone. Now, if we factor in the cost of people's lost productivity, for example, the cost of the work that is not being done because people are jailed for 2 years instead of, or in either incarcerated or in mandatory treatment and not able to work. If you factor in the social costs which are associated with having a criminal record and not being able to work in perpetuity, that would be a much larger number.
Okay, and that's not probably been taken into account. Palani, you've done a lot of work in this area for many years. I mean, you started with the Malaysian AIDS Foundation. How do our drug policies compare in terms of cost to other countries, perhaps?
I think this is a universal problem. When we look at our drug policies, the first law enacted in 1952 is a remnant of our colonial history. And we have followed the world's war on drugs policies that has happened in the West, particularly from the United States. And the United States was one of the biggest donors to the UN treaties, the UN agencies, and therefore a lot of the treaties are influenced by Western countries. And we see that across the world now. The war on drugs has really come down to Malaysia. The United States, when they started the war on drugs, their logo was drugs are public enemy number one. When we adopted war on drugs, our motto is Dadah Musuh Negara Nombor Satu. It is exactly the same. And what we know from years and years of study in this field is that the war on drugs has increased number of people in prisons. It has really contributed to death through overdose, death penalties, accidents, violence, gang violence across the world. It has disrupted families and social networks. It has created more harm. It has increased crime as well. So it has created more harm than it has done good. And it's exactly the same in Malaysia. What we see is that we have an overcrowding in prison. 70% close to 70% of our prison population are there for drug-related crimes, mainly for minor drug-related crimes. And when you say people who use drugs are criminals, then those are the easiest target for law enforcement, and therefore they end up in prison. So in terms of costs, it is the same. It is, there is a really great study by the International Harm Reduction Association looking at the cost of criminalization or cost of law enforcement. And we see that governments continue to pour an inordinate, in unimaginable amount of money into law enforcement to try and catch drug users and stop drugs. Even if we spend 10% of that on increasing treatment for people who use drugs, decriminalize people, channel them to treatment, we'll be doing a lot better.
You've always spoken about looking at this issue as a public health concern more than a crime. Help us understand that, because you and I grew up in the same era, Palani, and we were literally, it was in our face on television, on national television, on billboards, everywhere we went. We were reminded about how drugs are bad for you. I mean, as you said, dadah musuh negara. We don't see it very much anymore, maybe because national TV, people don't really watch anymore. But it's hard for us to reconcile that. How do we change that perception, perhaps? Elisabeth, you want to?
I would say, and let's not, drugs are bad for you. I mean, that's including alcohol, including tobacco, including caffeine. Drugs are generally bad for you. They're also attractive in many ways, can be a lot of fun, used occasionally and recreationally. But we don't want to encourage drugs. Drugs are bad for you. But addiction is a disease. Addiction is a disease that is treatable. And addiction to different types of addiction are treatable in different ways. So addiction to opiates, for example, is treatable with pharmacological interventions, which have been very successful, including in Malaysia. And there we can really demonstrate that treating people is a lot more effective than making them go cold turkey by banging them up and then releasing them to relapse very, very rapidly. So it's not that we're saying drugs aren't bad for you. Drugs are bad for you, but they're a disease. I mean, any kind of addiction is a disease which can be treated. So we can help people manage their addiction rather than treat them as musuh nomor satu because they happen to be suffering from this disease.
That was Indonesian.
Yes. Yeah. I want to also say that, from 1952 to now, our knowledge around drugs, knowledge around why people use drugs, knowledge around the different types of people who use drugs and the continuum of drug use, knowledge around how to treat drugs, drug use and drug dependence, we've learned so much. But our law is still in 1952. Our knowledge is in 2025. In 1952, we were told that drugs are evil. They can only be dealt with by segregating people who use, by isolating them and putting them in prisons. Since then, we have so much more knowledge and scientific research to show that that is not the case. We know that people who use drugs are in a continuum, from experimental, recreational, occupational, regular to dependent. Only 10 to 15 to 20%, maximum 20% of people go on to have a dependency. And dependency is, as Elisabeth says, is a medical issue, is a health issue. We know how to deal with it now. We have much better science to deal with it now. What our 1952 law and all the other laws say is that anytime you use drugs, we need to catch you and put you into either mandatory treatment or prison, which is not what we need to do at all. Putting an 18-year-old boy who's experimenting with drugs into prison only makes his life worse, because what you're doing is you're taking him out of his social network, taking him out of education, putting him in prison where his neighbors are better criminals or bigger criminals. So his education is all going to be crime, and he comes out becoming a bigger criminal. That's why we call prisons the university of crime. So this knowledge that we have around drugs being a health issue has not been adapted into our policy making. We need to do that. But we have 70 years of the war on drugs. We have decades of the government and the law enforcement telling us that if you have someone who uses drugs, the only way to deal with them is to isolate them, send it to us, we put them in a cage, and then everything would be okay. That hasn't been okay. It hasn't worked. So we need to look at what the science is telling us now. And the science is telling us that addiction is a health issue. It's a disease that can be treated, and the treatment is better than incarceration.
So let's be clear. Sorry, carry on.
I mean, to be fair, and the Malaysians in the room, which is everyone except for me, will correct me if I'm wrong. There is a law since 1983 which actually allows for drug use to be treated as a health issue rather than as a crime, which allows for people who are arrested for drug use to actually be treated to go into treatment programs. Now, the nature of those treatment programs, the investment in those treatment programs, the medical support for those treatment programs is something that I'm not qualified to comment on. But I think that it's not that the law doesn't exist to open the pathway in Malaysia to a more health-focused approach. There is a law, a basis of a law which does exist, which can open that pathway. And I think working with policymakers and others to take us further down that pathway and more effectively down that pathway would be a useful starting point.
What's that experience been like, Palani, working with policymakers? I mean, you're director of the Drug Policy Program Malaysia. I'm sure you've already started engaging with them. What's the reception been like?
Yeah, it's interesting. As Elisabeth says, that we have a law, the 1983 law, that provided for prevention and treatment. Was 1983. However, the treatment modalities were still incarceration modalities. And since then, we have seen changes. In 2005, we embarked on an amazing nationwide program to introduce needle syringe programs and methadone to treat people and prevent HIV. And that is recognized worldwide now and documented by the World Health Organization and the World Bank as a case example for other countries. In 2003, the government abolished the mandatory death penalty for drug-related charges. Mandatory. There's still death penalty, but mandatory was abolished. So that's another major progress that we did. In 2004, our National Narcotics Board, AADK, and the Ministry of Home Affairs also moved towards decriminalisation of drugs policy. There were a number of provisions that still need to be discussed around that, whether it's effective or not effective, but there is a movement towards a progressive drug policy. So when you ask me what it is like working with, I think our legislature, our members of parliament are very progressive. They understand that this is an issue for the people. And that's true. You go anywhere in Malaysia, everyone has someone in their family or their extended family or in their neighborhood who are affected by drugs or impacted by drugs. And so this is every Malaysian's issue. And so our members of parliament are really, but it is also an issue that is so complicated and so embedded in the war on drugs mentality, like drugs are bad, they are the criminals, so that stigma that also follows that once you're an addict, always an addict. Once you're an addict, you're a criminal.
Once you're a user, you're always an addict and a criminal.
Right.
You don't even have to be an addict to be a criminal. You just have to be a user.
That's right. It's so ingrained in us that it's difficult for any single politician or policymaker to step out and stick their neck out and say, yeah, I'm going to champion this. So that's what the drug policy program led by Professor Madhya, Professor Emeritus Dr. Adiba, and our small team at the Malaysian AIDS Foundation is doing, is really to create a movement, grassroots movement, and support the government agencies to have better understanding and to find ways of moving this forward in a way that can be owned by everyone. Can bring everyone together to the table to discuss it. So I'm pretty optimistic. I'm pretty optimistic as to where we're going.
I think it's education. And if I use myself as an example, who had pretty much the same views about drug addiction and the usage of drugs, what would be the one thing that you would sort of impart to the rest of us in order to change our mindset? Just the one thing, Palani, that we should think about in changing our views when it comes to this.
One thing.
Just one thing, Palani.
Just one thing.
Yes.
I think everybody base their opinion on drug policies and what needs to get done based on their personal experience. And oftentimes, it is important for us to look beyond our own personal experience. I also have family members and people in my neighborhood who are affected by drugs, and I see that. But not every person is the same. Just because I may have had a bad experience with one person who uses drugs, that we cannot translate that experience to everybody. Like I said before, 80% of people who use drugs are brothers, sisters, friends who are productive, contribute to the society, who are great lawyers and teachers and doctors, and so we really have this really negative, stigmatized image of people who use drugs because of all the media and all the media images of people who use drugs and all that we have been taught from a long time ago. So I would say just keep a much more open mind, understand a little bit more around addiction before we make up our mind.
Yeah, I think understanding that it's a spectrum is very helpful to understand that not everyone is at the edge of the spectrum. It's a wide spectrum. So when we talk about decriminalisation, Palani, just make it clear to us, what are we decriminalising? What are we championing?
I think Elisabeth started on that earlier already. Listen, when we are talking about drug policy reforms, there are a number of drug policy models that we can do. We can do diversion program. We can do decriminalisation. We can do regulation, and we can do legalization. Now, regulation and legalization is when you legalize the drug. So you can actually legalize the production, the cultivation, the production, the transport, and the sale.
It's the approach that we have for alcohol, which is one of the more dangerous drugs that we have in circulation now. Tobacco, which kills more people than any other drug currently on the market.
I think that is a clear comparison of socially what is accepted and what isn't. And it's conditioning of the mind, really, when you compare it, really. Yeah.
Whereas decriminalization deals with the use of drugs and the minor possession for personal use of the drug. Yeah. So what we are saying is the person who is using the drugs is not a criminal. He is the end product of the entire system. Yeah. From the dealers, from the people who are cultivating to the people who are producing. These guys, the chain of sale in a country just branches out, and these guys are at the bottom. And they are the ones who are most affected in terms of what we do in punishment that we put. We catch them, we put them in prison, their lives get destroyed, all of that we've talked about. We're saying that it's not helpful at all. It's not helpful to the families, it's not helpful to society, it's not helpful to the government. It costs a lot of money, it destroys a lot of life. You want to handle the issue? Confucius said, if you want to kill a snake, you cut off the head, not the tail. What we're doing is we're focusing on the tail And it's impacting our society, it's impacting our government. So move people away from criminal justice system into a public health system. That's what decriminalisation is. You take away the criminal element of drug use and minor possession and move them to public health system. That's it. Drugs will continue to be illegal. Drugs will continue. We're not saying legalize the drugs. We're saying decriminalize the person who uses the drugs.
The person who's essentially the victim of the system. But what I think that Palani earlier referred to the university of crime, that actually putting people in jail, putting people in touch with the criminal justice system is both entrenching this problem, expanding the problem because you're teaching people how to effectively work the system, but also, importantly, it's cutting off it is making people into permanent non-citizens, permanent users. So there's something that the language is quite shocking to me, the register of undesirable persons. That's pretty shocking, even in its language. Everyone who's been in jail for drugs goes on a register of their lives in Malaysia for the rest of their lives. So that person carries that stigma for the rest of their life. So their chance of, you do something dumb when you're 18 years old, and when you're 57, you still can't get a job. You still can't support a family. You still can't stand surety for anyone. These things are lifelong. So we're punishing people for experimenting, for hanging out with their friends in being subject to peer pressure, being victims of this whole system, which is a criminal enterprise at the top and a very profitable one probably. But the people who are the victims of it are the very ones whose lives we're ruining forever in the current system.
I want to give an example, and you can cut it off in your editing room if you want it. Do you want to? But I want to talk to you about Khalid, who is now the head of Committed in Pahang. Khalid was one of the person who uses drugs who came to our center in 1992 when I was running the center in Ikhlas, and Khalid had gone in and out of prison. Had gone through many different programs, but it wasn't until in his late 40s that he gave up drugs. And since he gave up drugs, he's committed to giving back to the society. He now runs one of the biggest treatment centers programs, DIC, in Pahang. Just won the Tun Siti Asma Award under Malaysian AIDS Foundation for his contribution to the country. But he's got a criminal record from when he was 20. He's now 70. He's got a criminal record. If he uses drugs tomorrow and is caught by police, he'll be under 39C, which is a repeat offender. It doesn't matter that he had spent 40 years clean and contributing to this and doing good things. The law says he'd be punished under 39C, and his punishment would be greater than someone who's just started using.
So how would we have managed Khalid better if we have decriminalized drug use?
Right?
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're trying to do.
What would Khalid's life look like?
Yeah, so if Khalid was caught for the first time when he was 20, instead of going through the police lockups, the court, the prison, he would then be sent to a public health system or a health system where his addiction would have been assessed. His drug use would have been assessed. His social network would have been assessed. So he would have gone into a commission that we are calling the Drug Use Prevention and Treatment Commission, it's DUPT Commission, where there'll be caseworkers, there'll be a medical expert, legal expert, who would assess him and say, okay, Khalid is only 20 years old. He has just been using drugs for 2 years. He's not necessarily addicted. Or maybe he is addicted. But what he needs at the moment is he needs to go into a treatment facility, right? So the DUPT can assess him and can refer him to the right treatment facility. So let's say it's a 18-year-old boy or an 18-year-old girl. She's at university. She will also be assessed by this DUPT, and the DUPT can say she's 18, she's at school, she's only used ecstasy once because she was going out to have a party. She doesn't need to end up in treatment center or in prison. We will give her counseling. We would give her community service. She needs to go and work in a community center to see what it's like. We will work with the parents to ensure that then she continues with her life. She's not put in jail or in treatment where the rest of her life is cut off. So that's what we could do for people like that.
And the facilities already exist. So the Ministry of Health has OSCA centres in, I believe, in every district now. I think there are 78 or 74 around Malaysia. These things already exist. They're all outpatient facilities. They're in regular health centres. So you go along and there's women waiting to have their pregnancies checked, and there are people having their hypertension taken, and you go to the drug counselling clinic. You're seen by people who are trained in drug counselors. There's always a medical officer on site. These structures already exist. They're new. They're not terribly well known. But this is already something that's an alternative in the community. Probably needs a clearer funding line to keep them, a budget line to keep them going. But this is something that already exists and can be a hub, together with some of the treatment centres that are under the criminal justice system or under the Ministry of Home Affairs and the AADK, the anti-drugs agency. These are things that already exist, and you can triage that, as Palani says. Probably this person certainly doesn't need to be in residential treatment. Someone who's already addicted and may need detoxification may need to be in a residential treatment where there's support for detoxification for some time. But that's an individual thing. We don't say, caught you with an ecstasy pill, banging you up in jail for 2 years.
Yeah. The other thing that, the drug policies don't look at is existing mental health issues, dual diagnosis, trauma, all of those. There are some studies that are coming out now that are showing that women who are, dependent on drugs, who become really dependent on drugs, often carry with them childhood trauma, physical and sexual trauma. A lot of people self-medicate for these traumas. We don't deal with that. People have mental health issues like ADHD or bipolar diseases. When they use drug, it actually suddenly works for them. We don't deal with that. So something like the OSCA service or the DUPT service that we are recommending can actually assess people for their dual diagnosis, for their trauma, for their mental health issues, and then refer them for services for those things, not just incarcerate them or put them in a in-house or inpatient facility.
Yeah, in fact, if I can refer to my interview with Neil Woods, that's exactly what he said. Every one of them had an issue in relation to childhood trauma, every one of them. And so that is something that's important. Yeah. Let's talk about women. Women are often left out of this war on drugs. Are women's voices taken into consideration in a big way, Elisabeth?
I nearly interrupted Palani earlier on when he was saying, so some guys, blah, blah, blah. The fact is, in Malaysia, it is mostly guys. The overwhelming majority of people who are in the system are men. Interestingly, of female arrests, it's a far higher proportion of female arrests are non-Malaysian citizens, compared with male arrests. But I have come across almost no discussion of particular needs of gender, the consideration of gender in the approach to drugs here. So correct me if I'm wrong, but the assumption broadly is that this is a male problem, and I've heard very, very little about special provisions for dealing with women. particularly in the context that Palani and I believe Neil Woods was speaking about, which is the victims of violence, particularly sexual violence in their youth. This is something that I think is an obvious starting point for the approach for treatment of women, and I have heard very little about it.
It's true. The World Drug Report shows us that when it comes to women, at least 30% of people who use drugs, whether in heroin and cocaine, are women. With amphetamine-type substances, the number is much larger. It's almost 50-50. There are actually a large proportion of women who use amphetamine-type substances. So it's not just about women who use drugs. It is also mothers of sons and daughters who use drugs, sons and daughters who are incarcerated, and the impact and the shame and stigma that mothers carry with them. It is also about the wives of a male breadwinner in the family. When that breadwinner is sent to prison or taken away, the wife and children fall below poverty lines. It is also about daughters and their fathers. So women are impacted in many different ways and oftentimes not get talked about because we're only focusing on the user, which we all see as male very often. So we recently did a really interesting national workshop. We brought together 36 women's organizations from across the country. And it was a really interesting debate of mothers, wives, and women who use drugs talking about the impact of these drug policies on them. And there are no good provisions. The one issue that was talked about by our former deputy public prosecutor, Sam Chong, was talking about how when women are incarcerated, they're not even allowed to wear bras because that can be seen as a weapon or can be used as a weapon. We see transgender people across the world who are caught for drugs sent to male prison, exposing them to sexual violence. We see the increase in the number of women across the world who are used as mules. You only have to see, the prison population, like Elisabeth just pointed out, the women who are foreign women are women who are used as mules. They are the easiest target for drug pushers across the world to recruit as this one because they end up being breadwinners for the families when the husbands are in jail. And so if you have 2 kids and you're selling potatoes in the market, someone comes up to you and say, I can change your whole life. All you have to do is carry this small thing across to the other border. I'll change your whole life.
And indeed, they do change their whole lives. Not in a good way,
Not in a
very
good
often.
way.
Yeah, very often not in a good way. Absolutely.
Yeah. So the women are of huge concern because either you are directly affected by it or indirectly affected by it, right? What would be a model, an economic model that you think would work for Malaysia, Elisabeth? It may be early days that you're working on, looking at cost. But what are you hoping to achieve at the end of the study, and what would you hope to, publish after?
So I think what we want to do, particularly with this study, is try in a more robust, defensible, scientific way, show the cost of the arrest, judicial process, incarceration, contact with the criminal justice system of everyone who is arrested under any provision that is or can be construed as use or personal possession. And say, okay, if you took this, there are going to be legitimate policing costs for the approach to drugs, definitely. But if you took this population out of the equation, if you took the approach that Palani was just suggesting, for example, where you have these DUTP first triage systems, and then as a consequence of that, put people to the places where they're most likely to benefit from the particular type of treatment that is most suitable for them. If you instituted that, took all of those people that are currently going into the criminal justice system, put them out of the equation and put them into a similar system, how much would we save for the state? That's our current very precise goal. And then the bigger question, I'd love to pass this buck to someone else because it's a very difficult and complicated study, is then to say, how much does that also save in terms of human costs and productivity for society and etc. Right now, we're not even trying to do that. We're just trying to say, here's how many billion ringgit a year you can probably save just by taking this section of people. We're not talking about traffickers. We're not even talking about people who are arrested for supplying more than the quite small amounts that are actually given in the 1952 law. We're just talking about everyone who's arrested for any amount at all that's below that, or for use.
Yeah, our members of parliament keep asking us economic models, and this amplifies the importance of the work that Elisabeth is undertaking at the moment, is really to look at all of the costs that is involved, like the prison, the law enforcement, the urine test, all that Elisabeth outlined earlier. That's a huge number. The huge number. Whereas when we look at the treatment that we are providing for people on this spectrum of drug use, the numbers are very small. So that's the first one to look at. The second one to look at, return of investment. If we invested in treatment, what we'll get. So if there are any members of parliament watching this, we are doing this cause for you. We're wanting to get this cause for you, and that's the reason why we're doing this. But
maybe we should approach it like corruption, don't we? I mean, it is a huge leakage. I see it as a huge leakage, unnecessary one, actually. Yeah.
And corruption is the other biggest non-spoken about elephant in this room, right? I mean, we haven't touched that issue, and Elisabeth and I have spoken a lot about different types of corruption in the work that we do. But the level of corruption that our current drug policy encourages is sinful. The people tell us about the corruption in every stage of their drug use and going into prisons and coming out and
or staying out of prisons in the first place.
Exactly.
The law is written in a way that it gives the police a great deal of discretion. It gives many people, right up to the minister, immense discretion. I'm not saying that they're necessarily using that discretion in a bad way, but the possibility is definitely there.
It's always a problem when too much power rests in with one person or just a few people. Palani, I just want to ask you, what keeps you going? I mean, you're almost fighting. It feels like a losing battle. But how do you wake up every day and want to do what you do?
I don't feel it's a losing battle at all, Mira. I don't. As you know from our previous conversations, I started this work when I was 20, looking at directly working with people who use drugs on the streets in Chowkit. At that time, being a minority person, Indian man from a tiny little town in Johor, coming out to Kuala Lumpur and seeing people who are much more marginalized than I was a really big shock. And so providing services directly to those who are so marginalized, using drugs with, wounds that are big and maggots crawling out of their legs and smelly and all of that, and then providing the immediate services was a battle that we had to do, and we saw some gains in that. We saw the increase in knowledge around HIV amongst people, amongst doctors, And then in 2005, Prof. Adiba, myself, and a few others, designed and supported the government to do needle syringe program and methadone program.
Which did come with some pushback initially.
It did. Exactly like what we have at the moment. There's a lot of pushback. People said, why are you giving needles to a junkie and you're encouraging drug use, all of that. But we reduced HIV from almost 80% amongst people who use drugs at that time to now about 1% or less than 1%. we did win some battles.
How long did it take you?
It took us, we started ICLAS in 1991. The government didn't start the national program until 2005. That period of time, hundreds of thousands of people have died. And of course, it was disappointing. But since 2005 to now, we have really saved a lot of people's lives. We may have saved people's life, but the saving people's life should not be our barometer of success. People's lives, the quality of people's lives must also be taken into consideration. And therefore, that's why we now fight for the change in drug policy. I think we can do it. This is a 70 odd years we've been doing something the same, expecting a different result. Definition of madness. It hasn't worked. So somebody needs to push this forward. And I feel really grateful and lucky and privileged and honored to be leading the process here and working on this. It's going to be difficult, but hey, a lot of things in life are difficult.
And we'll help you wherever we can, The human cost is something that's troubling me at the moment, because we always talk about the other sort of cost, financial and the human cost, as you were talking about. What would you like to leave us with, Elisabeth?
I just want to pick up on a question that you asked and what Palani's just said. I think, so you asked me earlier, what do you hope to do with this study? And I think one of the massive challenges in public health is that we focus very, very much on technical evidence of what works and what doesn't. So we do all of these studies which show very clearly that if you have a treatment approach, it works better than if you have a punitive approach. That if you have a treatment approach, you save this much money compared to a punitive approach, whatever. And then we publish in our academic journals and we wash our hands and we go home and we think we've done our job. But the fact is that public health is a political discipline. It's not just about the technical part of things. So Monash now is starting a School of Global Health in Malaysia, and I'm really, really happy to be doing this kind of work in the very, very early days as that's taking shape in Monash, that there's already this kind of partnership between people who are basically public health nerds, and are very good at writing, computer code and running programs and doing statistics, and people who are working actively at the interface of policy. Because what I do without what Palani does is a losing battle. And that's what public health has been doing for a very, very long time. So in thinking about Monash Global Health going forward, the fact that from the very beginning ideas of it, it's thinking holistically about the technical evidence, the epidemiological evidence, the medical evidence, etc., together with the policy evidence, together with thinking politically about, there's this law, and then the key performance indicators for the police, Ternyata, or something else completely. And so actually, until we change this, it doesn't matter what happens here. That kind of thinking, which is the sort of thing that Palani and his colleagues do, I think this makes a partnership that does make you want to get out of bed in the morning, because even though you lose some battles, eventually you win the war.
Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today. That was Palani Narayanan, Director of the Drug Policy Program Malaysia, as well as Elisabeth Pisani, who's actually a visiting scholar at Monash University, Malaysia, joining us to talk about the price of punishment, why Malaysia needs to rethink drug laws. This has been Future Conversations.
You were listening to Future Conversations, a podcast by Monash University, Malaysia. For more information, email mum.media@monash.edu.